Joe Frazier hit things for a living. Not punched, hit. There is a difference, and it matters. A punch is an action. What Frazier did was something closer to a decision. When he threw his left hook, he was not trying to land it. He was landing it. The motion was already over before the other man's brain caught up with what had happened to his face. By the spring of 1972, Smokin' Joe was the most dangerous man on earth. Or at least the most dangerous man not named Muhammad Ali, a debate that had been settled at Madison Square Garden 14 months earlier and was still being argued in gyms and barbershops from Philadelphia to Manila. Frazier had won that fight. By decision. 15 rounds. He had dropped Ali in the 15th, a moment that those who saw it live described the same way every time. A kind of silence before the noise, as if the entire arena took one breath together and then forgot to let it out. He was 28 years old, South Carolina born, the ninth of 13 children in a sharecropper family that moved north when he was 15, looking for work and finding Philadelphia, which gave him a gym and a trainer named Yank Durham, and the rest is the kind of history that gets taught in boxing academies. He had turned professional at 20. He had not lost a fight. He had won his last 15 bouts, 13 of them by knockout, and he had done it by walking forward. Always forward, absorbing what was coming in order to get close enough to end the conversation permanently. He was training in Los Angeles that April, not for any specific fight, his next bout was months away, but because Frazier trained the way other people breathed, continuously, without thinking about it, without needing a reason. The gym he was using belonged to a mutual acquaintance, a promoter named Carter, who collected interesting people the way some men collect watches, not for utility, but for the pleasure of having them near. Carter moved between worlds, the boxing world, the film world, the loose territory in between, where money and spectacle were always finding new reasons to overlap. Carter had someone else he wanted Frazier to meet. That is how it started. That is the easy part of the story to tell. What happened next, what was said, what was demonstrated, and what Frazier told a reporter 3 days later in a hotel parking lot in Burbank, that part is harder. The accounts exist in fragments, and the fragments do not always agree. What follows is assembled from those fragments, and you should know that going in, because this is a story about honesty, and it would be wrong to tell it dishonestly. Bruce Lee arrived at the gym at 7 in the morning, 5'7", 135 pounds. The body of a welterweight and the training schedule of a man who did not fully trust rest. He carried a bag that was too small for the amount of equipment he somehow packed inside it. He arrived alone. No student, no assistant. Just the bag and the walk he had. Quick and deliberate, like a man who had some place to be and had already factored in every possible delay. He had been in Los Angeles for 6 months by this point, caught between 2 versions of his career. In Hong Kong, he was already something close to a phenomenon. The Way of the Dragon had not been released yet, but word traveled. The industry traveled. People who saw rough cuts talked. His name was acquiring weight in the way that names do when the work starts arriving ahead of the person. In Hollywood, the story was different. He had tested for roles that did not materialize. He had pitched projects that moved slowly through rooms where nothing moved quickly. There was a specific kind of exhaustion that came from being closer to something than you had ever been while still being unable to reach it. Lee knew that exhaustion. He managed it, mostly. But it was there. Carter made the introductions. Frazier was already in the ring, wrapping his hands. He had the particular quality of attention that elite fighters develop, aware of everything in a room while appearing focused on nothing. When Lee walked in, Frazier's hands kept moving, but something in his posture shifted, just slightly. "Joe," Carter said, "this is Bruce. He does—" He paused. He was never quite sure how to finish that sentence. "I know who he is," Frazier said. He looked up. "The Dragon." Lee smiled. "Not performed. Actual. The boxer," he said. They shook hands. What happened in the next 3 hours is where the accounts begin to diverge. There is a version of this story where Bruce Lee challenged Joe Frazier to a sparring session within the first 20 minutes. In this version, Frazier laughed, not mockingly but with genuine surprise, and said, "You want to get in the ring with me?" and Lee said, "No, I want you to get in the ring with me." The distinction was supposedly deliberate. The phrasing was supposedly exact. I have looked for that exchange in 4 separate sources. Each time I find it, it is being attributed to someone who was not in the room. That does not mean it did not happen. It means it has been retold often enough to develop its own momentum, which is a different kind of evidence. Evidence of a story that people want to be true, which sometimes means it is. What everyone agrees on is that by 10 in the morning, both men were on the mat, not sparring, demonstrating. There is a difference there, too. Frazier showed Lee his hook, the mechanism of it. He broke it down slowly. The weight transfer, the rotation that started in the back foot, the way the shoulder torque preceded the arm movement so that by the time your elbow moved, the kinetic chain was already decided. He was not a verbose man, but when he explained physical things, he found words, the right ones, specific and accurate in the way that expertise made language specific and accurate. Lee watched. He did not nod along the way students do. He watched the way a watchmaker looks at an unfamiliar mechanism. Total attention, zero performance. He asked one question, about the shoulder. Frazier answered it in 6 words. Lee nodded once and said nothing else. Then Lee showed Frazier something. The accounts vary on what, exactly? The 1-inch punch appears in 2 retellings. The demonstration of generating maximum force from minimum distance. A fist that starts 1 inch from a target and somehow produces enough power to move a man backward 3 steps. If that is what Lee showed, Frazier's reaction is not recorded. One account mentions a specific kick. Another describes a joint manipulation that ended with Frazier's wrist at an angle he had not believed his wrist could achieve without breaking. What the promoter remembered most clearly was not the demonstrations. It was the silence that followed each one. Both men quiet, thinking. The kind of quiet that happens between people who are taking each other seriously in a room where most people do not. There was no performance, Carter said in an interview conducted 10 years later. Neither one of them needed to perform. That's not a thing you see very often. By 11, they were sitting and talking. And this is where the pivot of the whole story happens, not in a flash, not dramatically, but the way important things often happen, in a sentence that does not announce its own weight. Frazier had a towel around his neck and water in his hand. Lee was standing at the edge of the mat, still moving the way he always moved, slightly, continuously, as if standing completely still required an effort he was unwilling to make. They had been talking about training, about what the body could be pushed to do, about the difference between being in pain and being injured, which is a distinction athletes learn early and that most people never need to learn at all. You know what the problem with Kung Fu is? Frazier said. He said it without accusation, conversational, the way he would say the weather was turning or that the traffic on Wilshire had been bad that morning. Lee waited. Boxers don't respect it. Frazier took a drink of water, set the bottle down. That's just what it is. You walk into a professional boxing gym, tell them you do Kung Fu. They smile at you. Not to be rude, they just don't believe it works against a real fighter, against someone who is actually trying to hurt you. Lee was quiet. And does it? He asked. Then, I'm asking what you think. Frazier looked at him directly, long enough that it became a considered answer rather than a reaction. I think that depends on who's doing it, he said. And I think most of the people doing it haven't been hit hard enough to know if what they're doing holds up. The silence after that lasted several seconds. That's honest, Lee said. That's what I've got, Frazier said. This exchange, the shape of it, the substance of it, the specific quality of respect it contained, is one of 2 things in this story that remain consistent across every account I found. The words may not be verbatim. Memory compresses and adjusts, but the structure of what was said and who said what and why, that part stays constant. It was not a challenge. That is the first thing to understand. Frazier was not dismissing Lee, or belittling his discipline, or picking a fight with a 135-pound man in a Los Angeles gym at 11 in the morning. He was doing something considerably harder. He was giving a serious person a serious assessment, one that cost him something to share, because sharing it honestly meant acknowledging a limitation in something Lee had devoted his life to. And you do not do that casually if you have any respect for the person you are talking to. The respect was in the honesty. That is the thing that Lee understood in the moment, and it changed the entire register of the conversation. What Frazier was saying beneath the surface was, I am talking to you as a peer. I am telling you what the world you are trying to enter actually thinks, not what you want to hear. And I am telling you because I believe you are the kind of person who would rather know. Here is the part of this I keep coming back to. And I want to be clear, this is not in any document I found. This is what the story seems to point at when you read the pieces in sequence. Two men at the absolute peak of their disciplines, separated by weight class and cultural context and everything else. And the thing that connected them immediately, the thing that produced that particular silence in that gym, was a shared obsession with a single question. What actually works? Not theory, not tradition. Not the techniques your teacher taught you because his teacher taught him. What actually happens when you test it against a resisting opponent who is not cooperating, not pulling their punches, not giving you the angles you practiced? That question ran through everything Bruce Lee did. It was why his library contained more books on boxing and wrestling than on traditional martial arts. It was why he kept records of sparring sessions. What failed consistently. What failed in specific circumstances that he had not anticipated. Most martial artists do not keep records of failure. Failure is the part of the story that the tradition edits out, because the tradition needs to seem complete. Lee kept records of failure the way an engineer documents structural weaknesses. Not to be demoralized, to know. Frazier had learned the same lesson in a different language. Every time he stepped through the ropes, he was conducting an experiment. His body was the laboratory. The result was either he stood at the end or he did not. There was no place in that system for technique that looked impressive and collapsed under real pressure. His left hook was the most tested object in the sport. It worked because it had been proven to work, over and over, against men who were actively trying to make it not work, two men who believed the same thing, in rooms that did not usually talk to each other. 3 days later, a reporter named Gerald Sims caught Joe Frazier outside the Burbank Hilton. Sims was working on a piece about Frazier's training schedule, a sports section feature, nothing dramatic. He had been following Frazier for 2 days. At the end of the interview, almost as an afterthought, he asked whether Frazier had met anyone interesting while he was in Los Angeles. Frazier mentioned Bruce Lee. The reporter asked what he thought of him. Frazier was quiet for a moment. They were standing in the parking lot. It was afternoon. The sun was behind clouds, and the light was flat and gray the way Los Angeles light got in April. I told him something, Frazier said. I told him boxers don't respect kung fu, said that 3 days ago. He paused. He's going to change that. Sims wrote it down. He ran it in his piece, 3 paragraphs in, buried toward the bottom of a longer article about the upcoming heavyweight rankings. Not a pull quote, not highlighted, just there, in the way that significant things sometimes are when nobody has recognized them as significant yet. Frazier did not expand on it. Sims did not ask him to. It was an afterthought question, and it produced what felt like an afterthought answer, except that it was not. It was specific, and it was considered. And it was the kind of sentence you only say out loud about someone if you have thought it privately first, more than once. What had Bruce Lee done or said in the 24 hours after their morning conversation that moved Frazier from his initial assessment to that conclusion? That is the question the story does not fully answer. The promoter Carter referenced a follow-up meeting but did not detail it. Frazier himself never gave an extended account. We have the trajectory, the initial skepticism, the 72-hour window, the public statement, without the interior of it. What we can say is that the change was real, and that it came fast, and that Joe Frazier was not a man given to statements he had not earned the right to make. Bruce Lee's notebooks from 1972 are better preserved than most of his other journals. In the entries from April, there is a note that appears in slightly different forms across 5 separate pages. It reads, paraphrased, "The problem is not that they don't believe it works. The problem is that we have not shown them. That 'we' is doing a lot of work in a 4-letter word. It is not defensive. It is not angry. It does not argue with Frazier's assessment or try to reframe it in a more flattering light. It accepts the premise entirely and then moves immediately to the question of what to do about it. It is diagnostic in the way that Lee's best thinking was always diagnostic, not looking for comfort, looking for the mechanism of the problem so the mechanism could be addressed. He was not pushing back against Frazier. He was agreeing with him. He was taking the hardest version of the criticism and writing it down 5 times in April of 1972, because writing something down 5 times is what you do with an idea you intend to do something about. This is what people who sparred with Lee consistently noted. He was genuinely curious about being beaten, not in a self-destructive way. He was intensely competitive, and he did not enjoy losing. But he was more afraid of the comfortable lie than of the uncomfortable truth. He would rather be hit, visibly, provably hit, and have to reckon with what that meant, than walk through the world with an inflated idea of what he could do that would eventually be disproven at the worst possible moment. He kept notes on what failed. He sought out training partners who outweighed him by 50, 60, 70 pounds. He spent hours with boxing coaches who had no interest in what he already knew. Frazier had given him a version of that, verbal, without a glove thrown. The same essential gift, the gap between what you believe and what you have proven, handed across the mat in a Los Angeles gym on a Tuesday morning. In the last 18 months of his life, Lee trained differently. The cross-training became more systematic. The boxing work in his later movement is more sophisticated than in his earlier work, more economical, more grounded in the mechanics of real weight transfer. He brought in people specifically from disciplines that had historically dismissed traditional martial arts, not to prove a point but to close the gap, to take what they knew that he did not. Whether that morning with Frazier is specifically responsible for any of it, whether one conversation planted something that grew across the following months, cannot be established with certainty. People are not simple enough for single causes. Influences accumulate. They arrive from many directions and sediment over time. But the note is there, 5 times, April 1972. The problem is not that they don't believe it. The problem is that we have not shown them. There is a particular kind of meeting that does not announce itself as important. It happens in ordinary places, gyms and parking lots and the back end of someone else's introduction. And both people walk away knowing something they did not know before, without being able to say precisely what it is. The knowledge is in them. It needs time to become itself. What Joe Frazier gave Bruce Lee that morning was not a technique. It was not a lesson in the traditional sense. It was a mirror, tilted at an angle Lee could not have produced himself, because it came from someone who had no stake in what Kung Fu was supposed to be, someone who had no reason to soften the truth of what it had not yet proven. Someone who had spent his entire professional life learning the difference between what looked good and what survived. He's going to change that. Frazier said this in an afterthought to a reporter who was not paying close attention in a hotel parking lot on a gray April afternoon in Burbank. The thing that stays with you, once you know the whole shape of the story, is the tense. Not, he showed me something. Not, I was wrong. He is going to change that. Future tense. As if what Frazier had seen in that gym was not a finished thing, but a direction, a beginning. Work that was still ahead of the man who was going to do it. Bruce Lee died on July 20, 1973. He was 32 years old. Whether he changed it, whether the gap he identified in those 5 April notebook entries was ever closed, whether the boxing world came to believe what Frazier believed it would come to believe, the story does not answer that. The story ends before the answer arrives. What remains is the direction, the clarity of what Frazier named and what Lee recognized, and what 5 pages of handwriting suggest he intended to spend the rest of his career proving. He ran out of time. But the work was real. The direction was real. And somewhere in the record, in the fragment of a sports section feature that nobody was reading carefully, a man who had dropped Muhammad Ali in the 15th round looked at a 135-pound man from Hong Kong and said, "He is going to change that." He meant it. That is enough.